Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Knoxville, Tennessee, January 7th, 2007. A calm Sunday morning in East Tennessee was disrupted by a quiet but urgent call to police. A college student named Channon Christian had not come home the night before. Her parents hadn't heard from her since around 9 p.m. She wasn't answering her phone. Her car was gone. Her boyfriend, Christopher Newsome, wasn't responding either. What began as a missing persons report quickly escalated. These weren't the kinds of young people who dropped off the grid. Channon was 21, a sociology major at the University of Tennessee. Chris was 23, a former high school baseball star working a stable job and known to be responsible. They were both from loving families, both deeply embedded in their local community. And now nothing. No texts, no calls, no sightings, not a sound. The couple had last been seen on the evening of Saturday, January 6th. They'd left a friend's apartment off Washington Pike around 8 p.m. to grab dinner and return to Shannon's place. That simple plan never completed. Her last outgoing text was logged at 9:15 p.m. It was routine. No signs of fear or urgency. After that, complete silence. Both phones stopped transmitting location data shortly after 9:45 p.m., pinging last near Cherry Street and Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue, a few miles from downtown Knoxville. The area was not somewhere they were known to frequent. By the following morning, police had elevated the case internally, though they held back public statements. When two people vanish at the same time, it's either voluntary or it's violence. This didn't read as voluntary. The first break came midday January 8th, when officers located Channon's Toyota 4Runner in an area of East Knoxville known to law enforcement, Chipman Street. It was parked just off the road, locked, unmarked, unremarkable at first glance. The area had limited security cameras, low pedestrian traffic, and a history of narcotics complaints. Inside the vehicle, officers found Channon's purse still resting on the floorboard. Groceries, still bagged, sat untouched in the back seat. The front passenger area had dark smears on the upholstery, later confirmed to be blood. A rope-like material was observed beneath the passenger seat. The car was sealed and towed for forensic processing. Back at the lab, luminol revealed a more complete picture. Under UV light, the car lit up. Passenger side floorboard, center console, front door panel. Partial DNA material was collected for analysis. A latent fingerprint was successfully lifted from the inside of the rear passenger side handle. None of it matched either victim. Meanwhile, detectives combed through the couple's recent communications. Cell tower data provided a narrow window. At 9:45 p.m. on January 6th, both phones had pinged within the same 3-block radius. After that, nothing. The devices were either destroyed or turned off with intent. There was no sign of a struggle at the friend's apartment, no suspicious messages, no banking activity. There was a pattern, though, and it wasn't random. Around 5:45 p.m. on January 8th, a man walking his dog along a disused rail track off 9th Avenue contacted police. He'd noticed a foul odor and what he first thought was a burned mannequin dumped in a brushy patch beside the tracks. It wasn't a mannequin. Responding officers discovered a male body, nude from the waist down, hands bound behind his back with shoelaces, and a gunshot wound to the neck. The corpse had been set on fire post-mortem. The remains were confirmed the next morning to be Christopher Newsome. Dental records were used for identification. He had been shot 3 times: neck, torso, and head. Preliminary pathology suggested he had been sexually assaulted before death. The discovery moved the investigation into full homicide status. For Knoxville's Major Crimes Unit, this was now a 2-front operation: identify the perpetrators and locate Channon Christian, who until further notice was still considered missing. A command center was established near Chipman Street. Units moved door to door, canvassing homes and checking vacant properties. Search dogs were deployed. Local businesses were questioned for any surveillance footage, though very few had exterior cameras. There was still no communication from Channon's phone. No evidence of a ransom. No demands. No witnesses to an abduction. Just the car, the silence, and one body burned beyond recognition less than 2 miles away from where the 4Runner had been parked. Internally, theories began to form. One possibility a violent carjacking turned double abduction. The neighborhood had a long history with gang activity and drug-related offenses. But if this was a robbery, it didn't explain the precision, or the timeline, or why someone would go through the effort to bind, shoot, and burn a man in an open rail yard. Another theory emerged. This was targeted, not random, possibly planned, but investigators couldn't establish any current enemies. No ex-partners with grudges, no financial debts, no suspicious connections. They had no suspects. Just a vehicle with prints that didn't belong to the victims, a location neither victim should have been in, and a body dumped and set on fire like a message that no one could yet read. The Knoxville PD wasn't ready to go public with their findings. Not yet. But internally, one thing was becoming clear. This wasn't going to end with just one body, and Channon Christian wasn't missing. She was taken. On January 9th, 2007, less than 72 hours since Channon Christian was last seen, detectives received a new lead tied directly to the forerunner found off Chipman Street. The fingerprint collected from the vehicle matched a known offender in the system, recently paroled. That hit led them to a rental property just yards from where the car had been parked. The house was on the 2300 block of Chipman, a single-story residence, no camera coverage, no visible activity. Neighbors described it as quiet, though not in a good way. Detectives obtained a search warrant before noon and entered the property by force around 1:15 p.m. Inside, the air was thick. What struck investigators first wasn't a scene of chaos, but one of abnormal stillness. The kitchen appeared recently wiped down. Several surfaces smelled of chemical disinfectant. The floor showed signs of mopping, but not professionally. A pair of latex gloves lay discarded under the sink. The living room had no furniture beyond a stained mattress pressed against one wall. A pile of clothing was dumped beside it. Women's jeans, a university hoodie, a bra. The clothing was photographed, bagged, and marked for DNA. The laundry tags confirmed the hoodie belonged to Channon Christian. Search teams moved to the kitchen. In the corner was a large black trash bin with its lid loosely closed. When it was opened, the smell intensified. A black plastic bag was inside, tied tight but misshapen. There was no need for speculation. It contained the body of a young white female, curled into a fetal position, bound at the wrists and ankles, with visible discoloration to the face and limbs. The body was later confirmed to be Channon Christian. Medical examiners began their initial field evaluation within the hour. The decomposition state was advanced relative to the timeline. Core temperature readings were inconclusive, likely skewed by chemical presence. The bag she had been placed in contained dryer sheets, bleach residue, and traces of vomit. Ligature marks were present at both the ankles and wrists. A blue rope fragment matched what had been found beneath the seat in the Toyota. Additionally, there were signs of blunt trauma to the inner thighs and upper arms, consistent with prolonged restraint and assault. There were abrasions to the face and neck, as well as chemical burns to the mouth and genitals. Samples were taken from under the fingernails and from 2 foreign hair strands recovered near the jawline. There was no identification found on the body. Her phone and wallet were still missing. Crime scene technicians logged over 120 photographs in the residence. Notably, the fridge contained unopened beer and a half-empty bottle of industrial-grade cleaning agent. On the kitchen table was a spiral notebook with a torn front page. The remaining contents appeared irrelevant: lists, phone numbers, and doodles. Still, the book was bagged for analysis. Outside the house, neighbors began coming forward. A woman living 2 doors down reported hearing screaming or yelling late Saturday night. She assumed it was a domestic fight. No one called the police. Another neighbor mentioned seeing a woman looking panicked at the window on Sunday afternoon, but couldn't describe her clearly. That detail was logged but remained unverified. What stood out to lead investigators wasn't just the brutality, it was the effort. The effort to delay detection, to cover up evidence, to scrub a location while keeping it functional long enough to control and kill 2 people in less than 48 hours. And the timing aligned too cleanly. That was part of the problem. By the following morning, the Knox County Medical Examiner's Office released a preliminary ruling. Channon Christian died of asphyxiation. She had been alive when placed inside the trash bag. Based on oxygen levels in blood samples and bruising patterns, she likely suffocated slowly. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. The assault had taken place over multiple hours, possibly across both Saturday night and Sunday. She had sustained repeated trauma, including forced ingestion of bleach. She was not shot. She was not stabbed. She was disposed of while still alive and while fully conscious for much of the ordeal. Channon Christian died less than 50 feet from where her car was parked, less than 100 feet from a house with an American flag in the yard, in a home that had electricity, water, and people walking by it every day. She was 21. Police expanded their perimeter. Additional search warrants were filed for nearby properties connected to the same name that had triggered the fingerprint hit. Secondary suspects were now considered likely, not optional. Investigators restructured their timeline. The double abduction likely occurred around 9:30 p.m. Saturday night. Newsome was killed the next morning. Channon was kept for at least 30 hours. Her death likely occurred midday Monday. That meant that when police were processing her vehicle, she may have still been alive inside that house. That realization reframed the urgency of every procedural step, and it wouldn't be the last time investigators would question whether they were one step too late. By the evening of January 9, 2007, the case had shifted from a desperate search to a targeted manhunt. 2 bodies were recovered, both brutally killed, both with signs of intentional control, not chaos. A vehicle had been located, trace biologicals, rope fragments, a bloody interior, and 1 partial fingerprint had all pointed in a single direction. That print, matched within the AFIS, automated fingerprint identification system, belonged to a recently released felon, a 25-year-old male with prior convictions in West Tennessee. He had served time for armed robbery and carjacking. According to his parole file, he'd been residing at the Chipman Street address, on paper anyway. No recent check-ins, no verified employment, just a registered address and a thin trail of documentation. Law enforcement moved quickly. By 10:42 p.m., a warrant had been signed and a statewide alert issued for his apprehension. The next morning, his name was placed on the TBI's top priority apprehension list. Knoxville PD wasn't working alone anymore. The FBI Violent Crimes Task Force was now involved. Digital analysis of known associates began. Phone records, social media, prior incarceration contacts, any potential witness or accomplice was flagged and traced. At this stage, no statement had been released to the public beyond confirmation of 2 deceased victims in a developing investigation. But internally, a framework was forming. Someone had use of that house, someone with a history of similar, though less escalated crimes. Someone whose fingerprint was in the back seat of Channon Christian's vehicle, where no known friends or family had ever sat. That same morning, a team from the Knoxville Police Department interviewed the landlord listed on the Chipman Street property. He hadn't seen his tenant in weeks. Rent had been paid in cash by a friend who never gave a name. He provided a printed rental application from 3 months prior. The phone number was disconnected, but the emergency contact listed, a cousin in Kentucky, was real. Detectives made contact by noon. The cousin admitted they had spoken recently. The person in question had arrived in Kentucky unexpectedly just 2 days prior, acting nervous and asking to stay for a few nights. He had since disappeared again. Left behind was a backpack containing clothing, a cheap burner phone, and a scrap of paper with an East Knoxville bus schedule. The phone was transferred to digital forensics. Location data was minimal, but 1 outgoing call placed Sunday morning had connected to a number belonging to a female, Vanessa Coleman. She had no criminal record, no priors, no connection to the victims, but the name wasn't on the lease, and her identity had not been tied to the vehicle or the crime scene until now. Late on January 10th, Knoxville officers, working with Kentucky State Police, located Coleman at a residence in Lebanon, Kentucky. She cooperated with the knock and talk, answered questions without counsel, and admitted to being present in Knoxville the weekend of January 6th. She said she had stayed in that house with the suspect and some of his people. When asked if she knew anything about what happened to Channon Christian and Chris Newsome, she hesitated. The interview was paused, and she was taken into custody for further questioning. During formal interrogation, Coleman did not directly implicate herself in the crimes, but she did offer key logistical details. The mattress on the floor, who had access to the car, and how many individuals had been inside the house. Her timeline didn't fully hold. She claimed she left early on Sunday, yet Chris's body had been found after that. Investigators noted the contradiction, but held off on formal charges. Instead, they focused on extracting more names. Coleman eventually offered two, Letelvis and George. Letelvis Cobbins, as it turned out, was the half-brother of the fingerprint match. George Thomas was a mutual friend who had reportedly traveled with them from Kentucky to Knoxville earlier that week. Neither had stable housing. Both had criminal histories, including prior weapon and assault charges. Neither had legitimate employment. Suddenly, this was no longer about one man in a rented house. By January 11th, U.S. Marshals, now assisting on the case, located Cobbins and Thomas at a vacant apartment in Louisville. Entry was made without incident. Both were taken into custody on suspicion of involvement in a double homicide. Inside the apartment, investigators recovered a loaded handgun under a mattress. Ballistics would later confirm it was the same caliber used to kill Chris Newsome. There was also a pair of women's sneakers, size 6, with a small blood stain on the sole. One notebook, later attributed to Coleman, was retrieved from a backpack near the sink. It contained a series of writings, including one phrase that would become critical. "These days in the house, I'll never forget them." As word of the arrests began to circulate, Knoxville law enforcement prepared a press briefing. The city was about to learn the scale of what had occurred. Multiple suspects, 2 murders, and forensic evidence pointing to premeditation and coordinated concealment. In cases like this, the goal is not just to solve, it's to secure every possible angle before charges are filed. Defense attorneys would be watching closely. Every word, every photo, every link in the chain of custody had to hold. And while 2 suspects were now in custody and a third cooperating, investigators believe more were still out there. This case wasn't finished, it was just getting its names. By January 12, 2007, the investigation had shifted from locating suspects to solidifying what each individual had done and whether the evidence could prove it in court. What investigators needed next was a forensic chain that tied each suspect to a specific role in the double abduction, torture, and murder of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsome. 3 suspects were already in custody. Their statements were conflicting. Their timelines didn't align. Their claimed exit points from the crime scene contradicted cell data, witness observations, and most importantly, hard evidence. The Knoxville Forensic Crime Unit focused first on the notebook recovered from the Louisville apartment during the arrest of Letelvis Cobbins and George Thomas. Though it appeared at first glance to be generic, a few pages of dates and shorthand phrases, it included entries that hinted at knowledge of the crime scene layout. One line in particular stood out, him laying there, and her in the back, still moving. The handwriting, based on slant and pressure pattern analysis, was consistent with Vanessa Coleman's known writing sample from school records. But for the statement to carry evidentiary weight, the notebook needed to be authenticated further. A forensic document examiner performed indentation analysis on the underlying pages. On the sheet beneath the main writing, faint impressions revealed a list of first names, one of which matched a middle name known to police, but not publicly released. That detail was critical. The notebook had not been fabricated after the fact. The legal team knew this alone wouldn't be enough. They turned to the next layer. Biological evidence. Channon's body, recovered from the trash bin inside the Chipman Street home, had been subjected to a full autopsy with extensive DNA swabbing. From her mouth, 2 male DNA profiles were recovered. One matched Letelvis Cobbins. The second remained unconfirmed at this point, though familial markers suggested a close male relative. From under her fingernails, additional biological material was lifted, primarily skin cells. This profile had degraded due to bleach exposure, but mitochondrial DNA matched that of George Thomas, placing him at the scene during an active struggle. A third piece of physical evidence came from the knotted blue rope used to bind her ankles. Fiber analysis confirmed it was consistent with the coil discovered in the trunk of the Toyota 4Runner. Trace elements of soil found in the fibers matched sediment near the railroad tracks where Chris's body had been dumped. This created a direct forensic bridge between both crime scenes. The coordination between crime scene units, forensic biologists, and state-level evidence labs had to be exact. If any chain of custody was broken, the defense could move to suppress findings. But the evidence trail was tight. Each bagged item was logged, each technician signed, and each analysis time-stamped. Investigators now had 5 independent physical ties linking the suspects to the victims in 2 separate locations. Separately, firearm forensics confirmed that the gun recovered during the arrest in Louisville was a high-point .22 caliber pistol. Ballistic comparison with projectiles retrieved from Chris Newsome's body and the scene at the railroad confirmed it was the murder weapon. A single fingerprint, partial but traceable, was found on the magazine release. It matched George Thomas. This allowed prosecutors to begin refining charge structure: murder, rape, aggravated kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. Each count had to be mapped to a suspect. Prosecutors were adamant. The public outcry alone wasn't enough. This case had to hold under legal scrutiny, not emotion. While forensic analysis dominated the investigative process, detectives also revisited all prior statements. During a second round of questioning, Vanessa Coleman admitted she had written in the notebook. She downplayed its significance, claiming she was writing what people said. But the tense shifted throughout her entries, sometimes reporting, sometimes narrating. She also claimed she was never alone with Channon, but her DNA was found on a discarded water bottle in the same room where Channon was kept. Her exact role in the crimes remained unclear, but under Tennessee state law, presence during a felony murder qualifies as complicity. The working theory remained: she did not kill, but she stayed, and she didn't call for help. The broader implication weighed on both law enforcement and local media. How many people knew what was happening in that house? How many stayed silent? The forensic evidence painted a picture not just of brutality, but of shared knowledge and deliberate inaction. It's a pattern law enforcement encounters more than the public imagines. In crimes like this, what horrifies isn't just what's done, it's how many people stood in the room while it happened. By January 15, 2007, the case against the 4 detained individuals was no longer investigative, it was prosecutorial. Knox County District Attorney's Office moved forward with formal charges. The legal shift marked a new stage. The job was no longer just to find out what happened. Now it was about proving it methodically against each defendant. Each of the 4, Lettelvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Vanessa Coleman, and the primary fingerprint match, was indicted on 46 counts, including 2 charges of first-degree murder, multiple counts of rape, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated robbery, and tampering with evidence. The scale of the charges reflected the brutality of the crime, but also the pressure to make the case trial-proof. No assumptions, no narrative gaps. Every count had to be backed by physical evidence or documented confession. A 5th suspect, Eric Boyd, had not yet been charged in the murders, but remained under federal custody for unrelated parole violations. His involvement would come into focus later. At this stage, prosecutors focused on what could be proven in a courtroom, not in the press. The grand jury process was closed-door, but internal memos showed that the notebook recovered from Coleman's belongings, the DNA findings from the victims, and the verified ownership of the murder weapon were central to the state's presentation. Combined with partial admissions during interrogation, the physical evidence provided a scaffold the prosecution could build upon. Outside the courthouse, the public was beginning to learn the details. The case, up until then largely local, began drawing national attention. But the conversation wasn't just about the crime. It was about why no major networks had covered it until now. The racial dynamics of the case sparked debate. 4 black defendants, 2 white victims, extreme violence. Law enforcement stayed silent on the matter. The facts were already explosive enough. For the families, though, the focus was narrower. They weren't chasing headlines. They wanted accountability. A system that often moved slowly was suddenly accelerating. And for them, that mattered more than anything else. Inside the courtroom, the defendants appeared separately. No shackles. Standard procedure. Pleas of not guilty were entered on their behalf. Bond was denied for each. Defense attorneys began pushing back immediately, claiming the notebook was circumstantial, arguing that DNA evidence alone couldn't prove intent, and suggesting that their clients had been coerced into partial confessions without full understanding of their rights. The court wasn't persuaded. The strength of the physical evidence, particularly the presence of multiple suspects' DNA on both victims, outweighed speculative defenses. But the battle ahead would be drawn out. The state had to prepare for multiple trials, each with its own legal team, jury, and timeline. Behind the scenes, plea discussions began. Not publicly and not admitted on record, But the pressure was there. For prosecutors, securing at least one guilty plea could anchor the narrative. For defense, the weight of capital charges created urgency to negotiate. Still, nothing moved fast. What had happened in that Chipman Street house couldn't be undone. But what came next, how the system handled it, would be watched closely. And not just in Knoxville. By the time spring arrived in Knoxville, 2007, the Christian Newsome case had moved from arrest headlines to courtroom corridors. Pretrial hearings began in April. The evidence had been cataloged, the indictments filed, and the suspects arraigned. Now the legal process turned inward, toward jury selection strategies, admissibility hearings, and the slow, deliberate shaping of what the public would eventually see at trial. Prosecutors submitted motions to separate the trials. Trying all defendants together posed too great a risk. The evidence against one could unfairly bias the others. The court agreed. Each would stand trial individually. The first was v. Cobbins. As the state saw it, he had direct physical connection to both victims, matching DNA, and a partial confession. His was the case most anchored in forensic evidence. Still, the defense attempted to suppress key statements made during his initial interrogation, arguing they were given under duress and without full understanding of his rights. The judge allowed the statement to stand, though limited in scope. Only portions where Cobbins admitted to being present and knowing what happened would be read to the jury. The rest would be excluded. What mattered more, though, was the science. Lab technicians were called in to testify in preliminary hearings. They walked through swab collections, mitochondrial DNA procedures, and comparison charts. They laid out the process behind the rope analysis, the ballistics test on the .22 caliber high point, and the soil sample consistency between the railroad embankment and the rope bindings found in the SUV. The evidence was objective. What couldn't be disputed was the presence of these four individuals, each confirmed by physical trace, inside both the vehicle and the Chipman Street house. The only debate left was intent and sequence. The state knew the case would not hinge solely on crime scene photos or forensic printouts. The jury would want to understand motive, how a group of people could participate in something so deliberate and cruel. But in this case, there was no clear financial gain, no revenge, no extortion demand. That absence of motive posed a risk. In the eyes of some jurors, a crime without reason could appear unbelievable. To counter that, prosecutors focused on establishing what they called conscious disregard. The group dynamics, the duration of the crime, and the shared silence afterward all pointed to sustained awareness, not panic, not impulse. Witnesses would later describe how the suspects joked at fast food restaurants hours after the murders. A bank receipt logged at 2:30 p.m. on January 7th showed one of them withdrawing cash using an ATM near the house. Surveillance footage showed him smiling. These weren't the behaviors of someone in shock. They were evidence of calculated distancing. Prosecutors included them to show the jury a pattern of behavior, not of killers in chaos, but of people returning to routine after something they chose not to stop. While the court processed motions, victim impact continued outside the courtroom. Family members of Channon and Chris gave statements to local press. They expressed gratitude for the speed of the investigation, but voiced concern that the trials would drag on too long. Their grief was not performative. There were no spectacles. But their presence at every hearing, their quiet, composed attention, became its own statement. Cases like this strain more than court calendars. They test the limits of endurance. Watching suspects discuss plea deals or attorneys debate chain of custody tags, while photos of their children sat folded in wallets, was something few outside a courtroom ever grasped. There's no procedural fix for that. At a May hearing, another development surfaced. A fifth person, long suspected but not yet formally charged in the murders, was facing renewed scrutiny. Eric Boyd had been in federal custody since January for unrelated charges. But now, after a witness came forward with new testimony, his role in the carjacking portion of the crime was under re-examination. The state was not ready to file murder charges, but the walls were closing in. In August 2009, over 2 years after the murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsome, the first of 4 major trials began. The defendant was Cobbins. This was the case the prosecution had built its foundation on, where DNA, fingerprints, and his own recorded statements formed a structure that couldn't be easily dismissed. The courtroom was packed. Local media had covered the story for months, but now that it was before a jury, the tone changed. No speculation, no editorializing, only evidence, procedure, and testimony. The trial opened with photographs, carefully selected, court-approved, and presented without dramatics. The prosecutors didn't need to heighten emotion. The images spoke clearly: ligature marks, restraint bruises, evidence of chemical burns. One medical examiner described the injuries found on Channon's body with precision. There was no need for interpretation. Trauma around the wrists and ankles indicated prolonged binding. The angle of neck compression matched positional asphyxiation. She was alive when placed in the garbage bag. The DNA samples taken from her mouth, fingernails, and body were laid out graphically. Cobbins' genetic profile matched more than one site. The lab director walked the jury through the analysis without exaggeration. Markers, probability, scientific certainty. On the third day, audio excerpts from Cobbins' interview were played. He admitted to being in the house. He admitted to being in the room. He didn't deny the victims were held. His defense team argued that he never confessed to killing anyone, that he tried to calm things down. But the prosecution's position was clear. He didn't leave, and he didn't help. In Tennessee, presence, participation, and facilitation in a felony murder make you equally liable. And Cobbins wasn't just present. His DNA was in the evidence, his voice was on the recording, and his handprint was found on the plastic bag used to conceal Channon's body. The prosecution then called a forensic fiber expert. A short blue rope segment recovered from the SUV was chemically and microscopically matched to a longer section found inside the Chipman Street residence. Cobbins' hair was also found intertwined in one of the knots. The argument being built was that this wasn't just a violent act. It was controlled, coordinated, and deliberate. A plan didn't need to be spoken aloud to be proven. It only needed to be sustained long enough to become undeniable. Cobbins' defense attempted to create distance between him and the murder of Christopher Newsome. They argued that Cobbins was asleep when Newsome was killed, that his DNA was not recovered from Chris's body, and that another individual fired the fatal shots. But that didn't erase the timeline. Cobbins admitted he was present when the victims were taken, and the timeline placed all participants in the house during the full duration of both crimes. The strongest moment for the prosecution came when they walked the jury through the order of actions. The abduction, the isolation, the repeated assaults, and the decision to kill each victim rather than release them. They did not argue cruelty. They showed sequence. The final day of testimony came from Channon's father, Gary Christian. He was measured, focused. He had reviewed the photos, the statements, the evidence. He chose his words carefully. His voice didn't break, but it didn't have to. He didn't need to describe his daughter's future plans or childhood memories. He simply said she never stood a chance, that her life was ended by people who made choices, not mistakes. After 5 days of testimony and closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than a full day. LaTalvis Cobbins was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, aggravated rape, aggravated kidnapping, and robbery. The court moved into sentencing. The state requested life without parole. The jury agreed. Cobbins would spend the rest of his life in prison. No press conference followed, no public victory statement, just the conclusion of one phase and the beginning of the next. 3 more trials remained. When LaTalvis Cobbins was sentenced to life without parole in August 2009, it marked the first in a line of verdicts, but not the end of the judicial road. There were still 3 others: George Thomas, Lamarcus Davidson, and Vanessa Coleman. And the state of Tennessee was not finished. The trial of George Thomas followed swiftly. Although his DNA had not been found on either victim, his presence in the Chipman Street house was never disputed, and neither was his knowledge of the acts carried out against Channon Christian and Chris Newsome. Prosecutors argued that complicity was enough. His silence was as damning as a weapon. In December 2009, Thomas was found guilty on all counts. Unlike Cobbins, however, the jury imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty. It was a sentence that balanced culpability with the absence of physical forensic evidence. But it was Lemaricus Davidson who would receive the harshest judgment. As the ringleader, Davidson's fingerprints were all over the case, literally and figuratively. His palm print on an envelope found in Channon's abandoned SUV, his DNA on her body, and his house on Chipman Street, where horrors unfolded, sealed his fate. During his October 2009 trial, prosecutors did not pull punches. They presented a timeline that showed a prolonged, calculated chain of torment, murder, and disposal. The jury deliberated little. The verdict, guilty on all 46 counts, including first-degree murder, rape, and aggravated kidnapping. The sentence, death. Davidson remains on death row at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville as of July 2025, having exhausted key state-level appeals. His petitions for post-conviction relief have so far failed to produce any grounds sufficient for retrial or commutation. Next came Vanessa Coleman, a name that polarized the community more than any of the others. Though not a direct participant in the murders, evidence showed she remained in the house during much of Channon's captivity, writing in her journal about feeling adventurous. Prosecutors argued that she had numerous chances to leave or call for help. She did neither. Coleman was tried separately in 2010. Unlike the others, her trial emphasized psychological manipulation and blurred boundaries. Defense attorneys framed her as a naive accomplice caught in a maelstrom of violence. The jury returned a conviction for facilitation of both murders and multiple counts of false imprisonment. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. However, in 2012, her conviction was partially overturned on appeal. A second trial held the same year resulted in a reduction of charges. She was resentenced to 35 years, but with credit for time served and good behavior, she became eligible for parole by 2019. That year, her release was granted, sparking public outrage across Tennessee. For the families of Channon Christian and Chris Newsome, the legal endgame never truly delivered closure. While justice was served in a courtroom sense, the emotional ledger remains forever unbalanced. Both families became vocal advocates for victims' rights in Tennessee, lobbying for truth in sentencing legislation and tighter parole regulations. Their efforts directly contributed to reforms passed in 2022, requiring violent offenders to serve at least 85% of their sentences before parole eligibility. Even in 2025, the shadows of the case linger. The Chipman Street house has long been demolished, replaced by a city lot with no marker, no reminder, at least physically, of what occurred. But for the Knoxville community, the memory is alive. The case has become a reference point in local law enforcement training and university criminology classes, cited often for its brutality, its legal complexity, and the moral dilemmas surrounding sentencing and parole. What continues to resonate is not only the savagery of the crime, but the dissonance between justice and healing. Each conviction brought a name to a file, a sentence to a docket, but not peace. And the discomfort many feel today isn't only about what was done to Channon and Chris. It's about how close to the surface cruelty can sit in ordinary settings, and how fragile the line is between everyday life and irreversible loss. Behind every forensic fact and courtroom outcome is a quieter story of families fractured, communities shaken, and a society still learning how to confront horror without turning away. As someone who's walked you through every detail of this devastating case, I want to leave you with more than just facts. I want to leave you with a truth I've come to understand. Justice isn't always about punishment. It's about remembrance. It's about knowing the warning signs, protecting one another, and refusing to look away when something feels wrong. Channon and Chris deserved more time, more life, and more safety, and we owe it to them to create a world where that's not taken for granted. What do you think justice looks like in a case like this? Does the system go far enough or fall short? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video resonated with you in any way, if it made you think, reflect, or even grieve, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. If it didn't, I'd still love to hear your thoughts. Either way, if you want to explore more stories that reveal the truth behind headlines, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. More stories are coming, and your voice matters here.